How does that work? Better? Okay, I'll start again. Welcome everybody to this final Audit and Governance Committee meeting of this civic year. It's a hybrid meeting which will be recorded. Most officers are here and the external auditor is with us, and others will be joining remotely, and it is being recorded. We have apologies from Councillor Tony Mason, and I welcome Councillor Fain in his stead. Otherwise, we're for it. Do members have any declarations of interest regarding this meeting? No, thank you very much. Moving on to item 2, Chair's announcements. You'll be delighted to know I have none today. So we go to item 3, minutes of the last meeting. To approve the minutes and consider the action log. Are there any comments on the minutes, or are we happy to take them as a record? Mike?
I don't know if it's accuracy or perhaps it's said at the time, but on page 6, 3.2, there was reference to risk 21 about the affordable housing programme under the original devolution deal. I think it was actually under a housing infrastructure fund. So I don't know what was said at the time, but the minutes aren't accurate in that respect. So.
Officers will, I just remember, we've got to remember to put our speaker on, otherwise the recording doesn't work. I'm not doing too well at leading from the front at the moment. Fine, can we have a look at that? So the officers will have a look at the recording and take that comment into account as appropriate. Otherwise, are we happy to accept them as a record? Yes, thank you. Could we just have a look at the action log to see if there are any comments on? I've got one question. So that's on, starts on page 11. It's good to see that most of the items are closed. I don't see any comments. I just have one question regarding, on page 12, the last item, the Treasury outturn report says it's still open. It's the breakdown summary of slippage request to be provided to the committee. That was in the June meeting, but I think that should be closed, is it?
I will check whether that has been circulated to members, and if not, I will ensure it is done so, although I appreciate at this point we are now a month away from the next set of outturn meetings. Apologies if it has not been closed.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. The Chief Executive, I think, is now joining us to give us an update on the activities in the combined authority. The floor is yours, Eileen.
Thank you so much, Chair, and good morning to you all. Lovely to see you. A busy time in the world of combined authorities generally, and the CPCA in particular, and a few things I'd draw out for you, and obviously happy to try and take any questions you might have. So we have now very much a levelling up white paper, much anticipated. It takes a very strong and positive view around the role of combined authorities, with the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Homes and Communities saying that the government was committed to doubling down in their commitment to devolution. In tandem with this, the doubling down, they have announced the £2.6 billion Shared Prosperity Fund, which I think has been much trailed, remembering that this is actually a replacement for the monies that would have come to us via the European Social Fund. So not entirely new money, but pulled together in slightly different ways. And we, as a combined authority, are going to receive, on behalf of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, an allocation of these monies. And what I can't tell you is how much that is going to be, and varying amounts are talked about in different fora. It will be significant, but whether it will be as much as we would like to have is as yet something I can't report on. But rest assured, we are doing everything we can to promote the cause of getting as much shared prosperity funding into this area as possible. So that is to come, and that will put a very considerable requirement on the collective leadership powers of the combined authority to be thoughtful about what we want to invest shared prosperity funds in to achieve greatest outcomes, positive outcomes for those who live and work in our area. Slightly more parochial, but to those impacted, nonetheless, really important matters. Some of you may have been involved in discussions around a particular bus service, which was significantly impacted by COVID, and that's the number 68 bus in Wisbech. So what we have been able to do is to temporarily continue its service by putting a little bit of extra money in, which will allow it to run really through until the end of September and into, I think, just the beginning of October. That's to allow for further studies to be gained to think about how can we get a sustainable bus route into that area, or a bus service of some kind. And I think we're going to find, and the government has promised additional funding to support buses, but we're not seeing yet allocations of that would give us confidence around just how much service we are going to be able to continue to effectively subsidise. So lots and lots of work going into that, noting we've been actually pretty effective in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough at protecting bus services. We want to be able to continue to do that, but an enormous amount of pressure on actually revenues to do that. University of Peterborough, one of our very, very big infrastructure projects. I think we should be delighted that progress on phase 1 of that programme will see students actually take their seats in September this year. And work is going on really well, and we should be very encouraged by the way in which that's running. There are, of course, 2 other phases of the University of Peterborough programme on the stocks with us, one a research building and the second a further teaching support. We'll continue to work on that, and as I say, I'm encouraged by progress, but also what I hope you will take courage and confidence, comfort and confidence from, is we're doing a lot of work on actually drawing together for the purposes of the board and indeed for your scrutiny in the future. What is this all building towards? What is the totality of the commitment we want to make into the University of Peterborough? What's the ambition we have for it? How are we making sure that together with our partners in Peterborough City Council and in ARU that we are achieving the very best through the opportunities that not only the CPCA's money, but you know, significant amounts of investment from the Levelling Up Fund. What are they delivering, and making sure there are proper accountability routes for that. In terms of the other great work going on, a great deal across skills and the economy. So we've had something, the Cambridge Apprenticeship Training Centre, it's quite a mouthful, opening, and that's on land owned by Metalcraft in Chatteris, and we provided a grant for the training school to operate through our local growth fund allocation. So delighted to see progress in such an important area as that, and you know, much more focus I think now having a skills strategy in place that we really want to push ahead with, ensure that we're working with partners, and I'm delighted to say that our board really galvanising around having ambitions in the skills area, which are seeking to address known skills in the employment space, but also to plan and anticipate for skills that we're going to need if we're going to be able to continue to grow successfully the economy of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. If I move to climate, some of you will be aware a climate action plan has been developed, and that's a system-wide climate working group chaired by the Mayor, and that brings together local government, wider public sector, business and environmental groups. And the action plan sets out our delivery ambitions against the original independent commission's recommendations up to 2025. So lots and lots of work going on in that area, and really trying again to link it into to all of our work, be it in transport, be it in housing, be it in skills and skills development for climate related industries. So really trying to make the best of both the challenges we face around climate, but also some of the opportunities. On very local matters, the CPCA, I think we have mentioned to you previously, has been without a home for a little while, an office home for staff. I am now very hopeful that come the end of March at our board meeting, that leaders will there be able to accept a recommendation for the CPCA to take on some more permanent office accommodation, which is a hugely important thing for our staff to feel that they've actually got a base after, you know, the period of the pandemic when the lease was given up on the Alconbury site, to actually feel that we are returning to having an office. And I'm enormously grateful for all the work that's gone on there. And then in terms of housing, I heard you mention that earlier. Clearly, you know, the creation of real homes for people is amongst the most important thing that any organisation can do. And the small team we have working on this area, pushing ahead with enormous amounts of hard work and great partnership with our local authorities to get the very final schemes that we're able to get signed off officially started, and therefore able to draw down monies from DLUC. So huge thanks to them for what they are doing and what they have achieved. And I think we'd all want to thank them for their work. And then finally, and very much germane to the work and the value that you add into our work, I think I mentioned before that we have established internally a performance and risk committee, and that's now adopted a very purposeful rhythm within the CPCA, which I've been delighted to see, you know, senior officers of CPCA taking responsibility, not just for their own risks, but looking across and within and thinking about whether we are properly recognising and acknowledging the risks that we carry, properly categorising them, and then properly, of course, managing them. And we have a piece of work ongoing, which I think the chair was mentioned, it was mentioned to you, which is we are doing a root and branch review of our corporate risk register. And that to me is important because the corporate risk register has felt a little bit out of date and disconnected from the reality of the risks with which we're working. And so the intention, I think, is to bring to your next meeting a fully refreshed corporate risk register, and one that members of the executive team will come prepared to talk to. And I think that's amongst the most valuable pieces of work we will do in this quarter, is to get that into better shape, better reflecting, as I say, the reality of the risks that we carry, the thoughtfulness of the mitigations that we're able to deploy, the honesty of the conversation about how risks are crystallising or otherwise. And I will very much look forward to a good and substantial conversation with you all on that. But let me pause there, Chair, because I think I've probably consumed quite enough of your time on that.
Thank you very much, Arlene, and I particularly welcome your comments on risk and performance, which will help us with the next item on the agenda. But for seeing the impetus from your chair on this, on risk and risk management is something that we can only welcome as a committee. But colleagues, do we have any questions or comments for Chief Executive while she's with us? Mike?
Thanks for your report, Eileen. Very interesting and covered quite a wide range of subjects. So I'm afraid I've got 3 questions, if you like.
I've got my pen ready.
So in terms of levelling up, you said you don't know how much it will be. Is there any direction as to how it might be spent, or is it just under the combined authorities' decision? So that's the first one. And 2 points on bus services. So obviously we know that government funding as we come out of COVID is being reduced progressively, and there's a threat across the country that we will end up with less bus services rather than more, which goes against the better bus direction that we'd hoped we were going in. And also on bus services, is there any impact on the combined authorities' work on perhaps going for franchising of the Greater Manchester decision recently in court about their approach to franchising? And then finally, in terms of housing, so I mentioned earlier on about the HIF funding, the 100 million, but that wasn't actually directly part of the devolution deal. So have we got a long-term plan in terms of housing? Because it was one of the cornerstones of the devolution deal, and it wasn't, as I say, tied to 100 million, if you like. There was a lot of information in there in terms of what we should be doing on housing. Thanks.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much. All really important points. So on the Shared Prosperity Fund, as I say, there's at headline level, it's been announced, but as yet the methodology for working out what we'll actually get, so to go to first principles, how much money will we have to think about spending, that is not yet worked through. And so I, together with people right across the country, are lobbying for to make sure that the methodology is fair. So let me sort of say that up front. In terms of how it's spent, well, it will be a collective responsibility for the board to take decisions on priorities, and the level of the Shared Prosperity Fund invites us to think about how we can strengthen communities and how we can work on skills principally, and how that helps you to tackle inequalities. So that gives us a framing. We've then got to come up with a plan, and we do have some strategies on the stocks already, particularly around skills. But what we will want to do, and what we will need to do, because in order to actually get these monies, we have to put forward an investment plan, is to be clear what our priorities are, to get the board to galvanise around these, and to be really, really relentless in going after them and being able to demonstrate, because the key to success for any combined authority or any entity getting shared prosperity funding is to be clear about what you're going to spend it on, and then be clear that you're actually measuring the impact, the outcomes, what you're achieving through that investment. Because the Shared Prosperity Fund is not something that necessarily will be with us forever, and we've got to have proof points about how good we are at spending this money and the returns that we're getting from it, if we're to make a case about being able to sustain that level of funding, or indeed to grow it. In terms of buses, well, I think the commentary you make about the headline words about a commitment to buses and bus revolutions, and then the reality of the funding not quite matching those aspirations at the moment is absolutely right. And as I say, we should really applaud colleagues who've done so well in protecting our bus services as well as they have done during the period of pandemic, because believe me, if we have done amazingly well in that respect, so compared to other places. But the challenges are very, very real, that we will not be able to sustain that. And we are waiting an allocation around bus support funding, which was promised imminently, but hasn't arrived with us yet. So I think you're right that there is a real challenge, and we need to work incredibly collaboratively, and we need to also be quite innovative in our mindset about how can we get the greatest return in terms of public transport from the monies that we have available to us. In terms of franchising and the result of the judicial review in Manchester, which was long awaited, I think we are, well, I know that we are still pushing ahead in terms of looking at franchising as an option, and we want to go out to consult on one or two options to do with the future of buses in May, ideally. What we have to do, and what other authorities, not just Manchester, but Liverpool and West Yorkshire are looking at it as well, is franchising essentially an affordable option. So there's all sorts of modelling going on at the moment. to establish what is it responsible to consult upon, because we have to be convinced that we can, that franchising has many strengths, but it also has a lead period to make it affordable, and that's the work that we're doing at the moment. So I actually think we are actually further ahead than some combined authorities, in as much as we've got quite a lot of work on the stocks already in respect of this. And then in terms of housing, yes, it remains really important to us as part of what the combined authority was set up to do, in terms of not just building housing infrastructure and funding it, but also ensuring that we're planning properly for it. And that is the next phase of work, which we're just beginning now to devote time with our board to, and also other key stakeholders, to come together and to be able to say, as DLUC has said to us, what is the ambition for housing, what is the strategy for housing that sits across the whole of the geography. So that's the work that's ongoing at the moment, and that will really require us to be excellent at our partnerships, clever in our relationships with Homes England, and really thoughtful about what collectively we can best do. And collectively is where the combined authority comes in, because it is that part of the system where collective leadership is in place. So I hope that's answered your questions for you, or at least given you a sense of where we're at.
Thank you, Arnie. Thank you very much, and I can't overemphasise how important it is as a committee that your engagement with our business and providing this topical insight at each meeting is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Great to see you all. Thank you so much.
We now move on to item 5, which is the corporate risk register or corporate risk update report. And we've had a preface from the Chief Executive. And Robert Parkin, would you introduce, please?
Good morning, members and Chair. Thank you for the introduction. Ordinarily, the committee will take as an item the entire risk register with a highlight report of changes, including the top risks with narrative, and one of the recent innovations that we've brought is to have directors attend to respond and give an account of those risks. As the Chief Executive said in her update, the executive team, which is the lead team of senior officers at the Combined Authority, met as they do to carry out a review of the risk register, and there was a strong sense that the risk register really did need a comprehensive rebuild to make sure that it fully represents what the executive team considered to be the primary risks that the Combined Authority is facing. That review is underway. We had a meeting of our internal officer team under the Performance and Risk Committee, and that group is going to be taking a leading role in delivering the risk register. As the committee has been updated in other meetings, there is a Pathfinder review that's being carried out by RSM in a consultancy role to look at how we as an authority manage risk, how we look at it, how we present it, what our appetite is, and what support and skill set is sitting around that risk. So that work has come to fruition. It's being reported through to the Performance and Risk Committee, and having met this week, work has started in rapid progress to rebuild the risk register with a view to bringing it to the next meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. So that's my update. We don't have a risk register today. There was a strong sense of wanting to give something which was clear, fully updated, and something that we feel sort of, as officers strongly represents actually what the real risks are, the actual risks facing the Combined Authority, and we didn't have that confidence in the document as put, so we didn't want to take up this committee with a presentation of that document until it was reviewed. I'm sure, Chair, given that it will be a rebuild, we could think about ways in which to introduce it to the committee, possibly even with an offline briefing in advance once it's ready, so that when it is brought to the committee, then the best use of time is made in the public setting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Robert. We are asked to note this update. Do members have any comments? Mike.
One of the comments, Chair, that we've made about the risk register has been about scoring, and I wondered, Robert, if that was one of the things you are looking at, because I mean, this obviously isn't saying what your concerns are, if you like, and our concern as much as anything has been about scoring. Is that one of the factors you're looking at?
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely, Councillor Sargent. We're looking at a root and branch approach to the risk register to make sure that the approach to scoring is clear and useful and accessible, but also that it's accurate. Was there a specific point about the scoring you wanted to just raise now again for us, or no? But that's certainly among what we're looking at. I think very importantly as well, as identified in the review, the scoring needs to be against the sort of backdrop of what the risk appetite is of the combined authority. So there's a piece of work going in as part of this review to using that template and that approach to formulate what the risk appetite looks like. So we're we will bring something that is updated and in line with the professional intervention to improve it at the next meeting. And as I say, I'm sure that we can facilitate an offline discussion if that would assist.
Thank you, Robert. Graham Bull.
Thank you, Chairman. Robert, just a simple question. Who will own the risk register?
Ultimately, the risk register is owned by the executive team, which is of course led by the chief executive. But in terms of the practical side, and I think it's very important to identify this, it will have the right skill set around it. That's likely to sit under officers that work to the Performance and Risk Committee. As part of the Pathfinder review, we have a sort of summary of the sort of skills and profile of an individual or individuals that can best bring value to it. But ultimately, it's owned by the senior officers, of course, but actual day-to-day management, it will sit around officers within the Performance and Risk Committee.
Thank you. I don't see any other comments. I suppose in one sense one could be a bit disheartened that we're in year 5 and we're going back to basics. On the other hand, risk management is a great learning exercise, and I think we should welcome the fact that a root and branch review has been recognised as something which will provide a better insight to the risks facing the combined authority. And I think we should recognise too that the chief executive places risk at the forefront of how the combined authority needs to look after its affairs. So we can welcome that too. And I look forward to our next meeting to have the updated risk register and the first opportunity to ask lead directors about the risks when we are at our next meeting. So thank you. We now come to item 6, which is the internal audit progress report. Internal audit's got 2 items on the agenda, so we can try and keep next year's work to one side whilst we look at the progress report, and then the subsequent item will be next year's work. RSM, the internal auditors, are joining us remotely, and there's Dan Harris, and I think Jay Desai might be with you as well. But Dan, please introduce your progress report.
Yes, thank you. Excuse me, thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone on the committee. So if I could, to take you to page 19 of your pack, that summarises the key messages. So you can see there that we've finalised 3 reports since the January Audit Committee, which obviously wasn't that long ago, but nonetheless, members will recall there's quite a programme of work to deliver in Q4. So of those 3 reports, one was a reasonable assurance opinion on the key financials. review, and there were 2 further advisory reviews that were undertaken. We've also got a payroll review in progress. Actually, that has now substantively finished the sort of my core work on that area. We have enlisted the assistance of specialist payroll colleagues who actually do sort of run outsourced payroll services, and they were in the process this week of rerunning the payroll as an exercise as the part of that scope. So we should be easily in a position to finalise that report for your June meeting. And then I mentioned, obviously, and the chair mentioned in his introduction, we've also got the 22-23 plan. So that was the sort of the key messages in terms of internal audit activity. You can see on page 20 the main findings from our reviews. I'll be happy to take, obviously, any comments on either page 20 or page 21 in terms of the 3 final reviews. Appendix A, page 22, confirms that we've finalised 5 reviews now year to date. I mentioned the payroll, which it says field work in progress. That's pretty much field work complete now. And then we've got the 4 remaining reviews that are being undertaken this month. So all of those are scoped, all resource is available, all officers at the authority side know those audits are happening. So I hope to be in a position, and I see no reason as we stand now, that we couldn't be bringing final reports to your June meetings for all of those audits alongside my year-end report, which will obviously include my year-end opinion that will flow through to your annual governance statement. And I think what I've just put some sort of commentary further on in the progress report in relation to that, to say that, and that's on page 25, to say that year to date, we've not had any negative opinions from those 5 final reviews. Clearly, what I do just need to reflect on, and this won't result in a qualification, but I do need to reflect on the follow-up work that we've been doing on the IT framework, because you may recall that was a negative opinion last year. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion already this morning on the risk management framework. Members may recall that our risk management audit last year was a partial assurance opinion. You may have noted as well that we've had a change to the programme. Given all of the update that's been provided in relation to risk management, it was felt that there was little point in delivering that risk management audit in March, because obviously your officers are in the process of refreshing and a complete overhaul of the latest risk register. So what we've done is we've brought forward one of the audits from the 22-23 programme. That's on the capital programme, and that will be commencing and being delivered in March. I think the other thing, just the last thing from me, Chair, just before we move to questions, just at the bottom of page 25 of your papers, I mention this specifically because it's a requirement of our contract with you to continue to meet the public sector internal audit standards, and this external review of quality is only required to happen once every 5 years. So this isn't something I would be referencing at each year, but nonetheless I've included a client briefing as well that's attached to your papers that gives you a little bit more detail of what that external quality review entailed. We actually appointed another firm to do that independent review, but really just to sort of assure the committee that we continue to meet those public sector internal audit standards. But happy to pause there, Chair, and take any questions you may have.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Our role this morning is to receive and note the progress report. Do members have any comments?
Thank you,
Yeah,
Chair.
listen.
On page 24 at the bottom, Dan, it talks about a delay in HR policies, and the reason that you were asked to delay a review of HR policies was due to the delay in planned externally commissioned work within this area. As we're getting near the end of the financial year, I wondered if you or Eileen or somebody else could give us an update on where we are with this externally commissioned work, because I want us to raise a separate issue, Chair, about next year's programme when we get to that paper.
I think, to be fair, Councillor, that might be better for an officer. I'm unsighted on exactly where that where that work is currently.
Is there any 7th Cavalry to help us?
I'm afraid there isn't in detail here. Of course, we can take it away and come back with an update through RSM.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments that members wish to make? Okay, if I could draw our attention to the advisory report on the one CAM, which is on page 20. Members will recall that this piece of work we commissioned at the request of 2 of the CPCA board members. As they had questions about this process. And the advisory report is largely positive in the sense of the processes that were used to the decision-making that took place. But they have identified a number of learning points, which particularly relate to transition and how these matters are organised. And I wanted to offer the idea that as this report work was commissioned by 2 members of the CA board, and it does give some lessons for the transition, I wanted to see if members were comfortable with the thought of forwarding the report to the CA board for information and draw their attention to the opportunity to draw for the CPCA to draw some lessons in the transitional planning henceforth, and also to make the members aware that the 2 board members who raised the requirement for this work would be given a briefing if they asked for it by officers on the full report. And I just wanted to check that members were comfortable with both those approaches. Right.
If you're proposing that, Chairman, I'm happy to second.
Obviously, we haven't seen the full report, and I see that it's suggesting perhaps some amendments to the Constitution. So it looks as though there might be a bit of detail which eventually will come back to us, perhaps for next year. So that will be interesting.
Thank you. I take that as support. Thank you very much. Okay, you're on again, Dan, with your next item, which is the
Yes, thank you, Chair. So yes, agenda item 7, the internal audit plan for 22-23, and really as the sort of as the paper and the covering paper introducing the plan and the wider strategy refers to, this is an opportunity either today or I'm quite happy to receive comments and ideas from members outside of the meeting around the suggested coverage for 22-23. So you may recall this time last year we brought to you the current financial year's programme, but sitting alongside that is a wider strategy, which obviously is driven by your or the combined authorities corporate risk register. Now, we've heard at some length today that document is currently being refreshed, and so I took the decision in conjunction with officers and the chair that actually we needed that updated risk register before we brought with you a fully fledged plan today, only to see that you may have some slightly different risks or completely different scored risks sitting on that corporate risk register. So hence that's why we've sort of not got a fully drafted internal audit plan for next year with you today. That will come through to your June meeting. And what I have done, however, is sort of put together in the document some of the key sort of feedback that we'd received to date. But I can't overemphasize enough that I want this this plan and the wider strategy to obviously be fully risk driven and driven by the authorities' risks, which are obviously, as we've heard, are in the process of being refreshed, overhauled, whichever we want to call that. But again, what I've done for sort of members' information at page 42 at Appendix A is just shown the backward-looking coverage and the forward-looking coverage as it is linked to the existing risk register, just so that you were sort of cited on the latest position, recognising that those risk descriptions and indeed some of the scorings may well be changing as we speak and over the next few weeks. So happy to pause there, Chair, and have some open discussion. But as I say, the offer is there that if there are thoughts that come through over the next couple of months, I'm happy to sort of reflect on those and discuss further with officers in meetings that we will hold over the next few weeks.
Thank you, Dan. So we're asked to consider the themes and the overall approach, bearing in mind the constraints of not having a solid risk register in which to cross-check the work versus the priorities. So do people have any comments or questions?
I've got a few questions, please, Chair. Certainly when we get the new risk register, it would be good to do the cross-check exactly as Dan is suggesting. I'm hoping that the new risk register will have a lot more about COVID and whatever the new normal is, and it might need to include something about the rampant inflation that's resulting from Ukrainian war and other international activities. The third point I wanted to raise was what is meant by people management and HR policies. So this goes back to my previous question about what the external work is going on. And just to put that into context, we had a situation in Cambridgeshire County Council where a former councillor has been found to have bullied staff, and as a result of that, internal audit led a refresh of the whistleblowing policy and the respect at work policy. So a question here is, will this investigate whether there are any similar issues of bullying of staff, either by other staff or by members or whoever, as part of this work? Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Dan, do you have any comments? Or?
So I think my initial comments would be that clearly what I can do ahead of the next meeting is obviously get a full briefing from officers where they are in terms of the commissioning of this external review of HR policies. I believe that is why we paused or stopped delivering an audit in this area under the current year's programme, because clearly there was going to be some externally commissioned work that was, the implication was that it was going to be a complete refresh and overhaul of some of the HR policies. So what I would say is, depending on the timing of that work, I think it could be quite appropriate to look at really probably compliance with those policies. If you're engaging with a professional firm to revise the HR policies, it may well be that what we do is look at sort of compliance and provide some assurance to officers and to this committee that there is compliance with a number of those new policies. So I think my only comment at this stage is it depends how quickly those policies are written in terms of whether we will have enough time to include a review in the latter part of next year around compliance with those policies. There's no reason why, Councillor, that we couldn't look at something like whistleblowing as part of an internal audit review.
Well, that's very helpful, and let's see next time what the external work is and also the other points which I raised, which Dan hasn't referred to, about the risk register and COVID and inflation. But
Okay,
I think that'll be for next time.
And I think it's not just the policies and the procedures. The hard thing with the bullying, whistleblowing dimension is the culture. Do the people who work for the Combined Authority really believe that the Combined Authority has got these fairnesses and redresses at their heart? So when you're developing your thinking of how you might conduct such an audit into that area, I think it'd be good to be reassured that you can find a way which will give some insight as to how people believe the Combined Authority is committed to these policies and procedures. Thank you. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, just so Dan will obviously need to speak with officer colleagues about the scope of such an audit, and it feels to me that there is a difference between a review of the currency of policies and possibly a dive into the effectiveness of individual elements and operating documents within that, such as a whistleblowing policy. I think an analysis of culture it may be something that could sit elsewhere in the organisation, for example, and it could be that those things sit more with an employment committee. So what I would suggest, rather than sort of leave the committee today thinking that will be a definite piece of work, that sort of examination of working culture through an audit, I think it's probably better that that's sort of taken off to have a discussion with the assistant director with HR, for example, to just identify whether where that may fit as a piece of work, or whether it's picked up as part of something else. For example, the substantial work that's going on at the moment around transformation, because of course lots of that is around culture and behaviours. So it may be that that's picked up elsewhere. I just wanted to make that point, and I'm sure Dan appreciates that will need to be sort of subject to a separate discussion.
Thank you, Robert. As long as when we come back to the proposed plan at our next meeting, that we encapsulate the essence of what we've just discussed, then I think that will do for now. Does anybody have any other comments on the themes and what's in Dan's paper? Mike.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, as I said before, I'm interested particularly in the changing nature of the business, if you like, and I very much welcome that RSM are getting involved as we develop new procedures and processes, which is good. But I think if we look at the changing nature, so we talked about franchising, and that's probably a few years away, but that will very much change the nature of the business. We heard, was it 2 meetings ago, about they want to do more about convening and facilitating. And we've got things like the national funding schemes, such as the Energy Hub, which changes the nature of the business, because we're actually, in effect, looking after a number of areas around the southeast. So we're breaking out, and how are we managing those sort of situations? And certainly from what Eileen was saying earlier, the chief executive, there'll be the Levelling Up Fund. And I think there's a danger that this internal audit is very much around marking once we've started doing things and delivering. And the horse may have almost bolted on some of these things. So I'd be interested to make sure that we actually reflect the changes when they come along and make sure that we're on top of them. So I don't know if Dan's got any comments on how we do that.
Dan, do you want to respond?
Well, I think clearly it is as Councillor Sargent says, very much a moving agenda with a lot of change. So one way that we can be involved in that is to, for example, provide advice and assistance to officers through certain boards or advisory groups. So that is allowed under internal auditing standards for us to provide some sort of ongoing sort of live advice in some of those areas. So it may not constitute a formal audit report, but could involve some input by myself or my team in some of these areas as they are sort of live scenarios. I think the other thing that I would say is clearly when we understand some more about some of the funding that's going to come through to the authority, that we absolutely have discussions with the executive team around is that a good time at the beginning of that funding being announced to get in and do an internal audit of that area. So I think there's sort of 2 or 3 different approaches that that we could adopt to Councillor Sargent's suggestions.
Thank you, Dan. Any other comments? I've got a couple, Dan. First, I was very pleased to see on page 40 the item on subsidiary companies. As you know, that's something that the committee continues to try and understand. So I welcome that, and I'm sure it will feature in your final proposal. And the other point I had is when we spoke informally, you had hoped to identify some work which you could start early in the next civic year, but that was slightly buffeted by the fact that the risk register is to be overhauled. As we're not meeting again until June, I wondered if you'd reached a conclusion on whether there was any work you'd want to kick off early in your next year, and whether you'd like to share that thought with us and we could see whether we're comfortable.
Yes, thank you, Chair. No, you're quite right. So I think there were 2 reviews that we had discussed with officers could potentially kick off in Q1. One of those was on the capital programme, and you may recall from the previous paper I've said that actually that has already substituted the risk management review by being brought forward into the current year's plan. So obviously that has largely taken care of itself. The other one was a potential review that I had scoped and we were potentially going to be delivering in this current year with Robert Parkin, just around data protection. So I can have a further conversation with Robert, but that was a potential area that could be Q1 coverage.
So, members, would we be comfortable with that approach, that if in Q1, and before the committee has considered the full programme, if the external auditor and officers feel that the evidence to get work started early on data protection, would we be happy to approve that? Okay, so that was a nods all round. So I'd like to be informed once you've decided with officers, but you have the go-ahead from the committee on that basis. Thank you, Dan. And
fantastic, thank you.
To keep remembering. All right, so now we turn to the external audit report results for 2021, and as members recall, this has been quite a long journey for a variety of reasons. And I'm delighted to say we're joined today by Mark Hodgson from the external audit as young to introduce the report. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. So our auditor's annual report is a summary of the audit work that we completed in respect of the 2021 financial year. It does replace the old annual audit letter, which some members may have got used to, but in essence does exactly the same thing as a summary report. So all the key messages within it are ones that you will have seen throughout the year and our audit results report, which came to committee in July with an addendum in December. The only update of substance is to inform you that we did sign our audit opinion on the 17th of December after the committee on that date. And we are still waiting for HM Treasury and the National Audit Office to issue their guidance in respect of whole of government accounts. And until they do that, we can't certify close of the audit because that is a requirement of the code upon auditors, and clearly we can't certify without knowing if and what we would need to do. So with that, and with the messages being ones that you have seen throughout the year, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions, colleagues? David Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Not so much a question, more just to record, I'm sure, on behalf of everybody, our thanks to Mark and his team at EY for the work they've done, and congratulations to John, etc. Very pleased to see it's unqualified.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, so our job was to...
Chair, sorry, I was trying to catch your eye. Two questions really, Mark. One is around value for money, because I suppose if you ask somebody in the street what value for money means, they wouldn't necessarily see what you've commented in your document as being around value for money. One of the big expenditures for us, of course, is on capital projects, for instance, and I didn't see any reference there as to how that might be judged, and perhaps that's not your role, but I'd be interested in any comments on that. And the other one really is around governance, which I've always struggled with as to what we need to cover in terms of governance as a committee. But on page 69, it talks about informed decisions. And I wondered how you were judging whether we were having informed decisions as a combined authority. You mentioned the board, but you didn't mention executive committees, for instance. So how have you judged this? Because I've certainly raised it a number of times on this committee, and I don't think I've got a lot of traction, but you know, to me, it's crucial that we make informed decisions, and I wondered how you've been judging it.
Two very good questions, the answer of which hopefully will appease you to some extent, but value for money is a very nebulous area between what somebody on the street, as you say, might deem it to be versus our responsibilities. And our responsibilities are to ensure that an audited body has appropriate arrangements in place that would ultimately derive value for money through economy, efficiency and effectiveness being kind of the outcomes. So there is no specific causal link between the arrangements and us deeming something as an outcome to represent value for money, but we would report by exception if an outcome was so not value for money that it was contrary to the arrangements that were in place. So it's kind of negative reporting as opposed to positive affirmation. But clearly having a sound and robust set of arrangements in place should lead an authority to make decisions that represent value for money, though clearly that is not always the case all across the country. In terms of informed decisions, what we are interested in, again, is the arrangement. So what is the hierarchy of information flowing through the authority, through executive committees or discussion groups that get to the board where a decision is made? And are they based on information that comes in the form of reports that, well, are the reports that are provided have a full fact pattern in them that would lead a group of members to make an informed decision based on that fact pattern? So again, not judging the decision, but how do you get to that decision?
Thank you. I think nebulous for value for money is a very good way of describing it, because it's a bit like beauty in some regards, isn't it? Graham.
Well, can I ask another nebulous question, but probably for John rather than for Mark? So on the bottom of page 66, about financial sustainability, it says that the authority has no funding gaps, and due to the way it is funded, it does not currently have any need to identify savings. Well, the rest of us public sector bodies are in desperate need of funding and are always looking for savings. Now, I think that is from quite a legitimate point of view from an audit perspective, but hopefully it isn't from the way CPCA officers run the organisation.
Yes, thank you. No, you are right. We are very differently funded to other the rest of the constituent councils. I guess one of the benefits that we have of the 30-year devolution deal is that that is worth £20 million to us on an annual basis, which is split between revenue and capital gain share, which supports the combined authority going forward. Obviously, that's subject to 5-year reviews. But we are sort of conscious, and this was which came out in the park conversation that we had earlier on the week, which was discussed about future funding. So the combined authority, and that's common with all combined authorities, really need to have guaranteed future funding. A lot of the other combined authorities have other revenue streams which we don't have, and a number of our funding streams are coming to an end over the next few years. So Transforming Cities Fund, Local Growth Fund, and obviously the Housing Fund is coming to an end. So we do, as an organisation, need to look to the future to see what other sources of funding might be available, and part of that might be looking at the best ways of using the Shared Prosperity Fund that Diane was talking about later. So yes, we do have different financial concerns, and also, as you mentioned earlier on, about inflation. So that's a very real risk, both in terms of the cost to delivery projects, but also some of that revenue, or that revenue funding is £8 million over 30 years, and given that inflation currently is 5-6% or possibly going up to 10%, again, that's a very real risk. So whilst we don't have, we're in a good position at the moment, we've got a balanced budget, we are aware of future financial risks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for the report, and for members for the comments and questions. And our job was, which I think we've done, was to receive and note the results. Thank you. And one last thing, Mark, when will we see you again for next year's plan?
So I've undertaken with John to come to June's meeting with the plan for 21-22.
Thank you. Look forward to it. Next, we move on to item 9 in the agenda, which is the local assurance framework, where Rina Rujam is joining us to take us through the report, and our role is to approve and recommend the amended draft of the local assurance framework and to note the revised draft local assurance framework will be presented to the business board on the 14th of March. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This report is being presented to the committee today to seek approval of the changes recently made to the local assurance framework. The revisions to the local assurance framework have been implemented following guidance issued by the institutional assurance team, who republished the National Local Growth Assurance Framework in September 2021. Colleagues at CPCA were advised by BAIS that there were no significant changes made to the LEP obligations. A summary of changes have been highlighted at section 2.3 of this report. The changes that were made to the National Local Growth Assurance Framework were implemented to provide further clarity on a small number of areas. Further, in light of the pandemic, a new set of exemptions were also issued which offer temporary adjustments to the compliance requirements of the National Local Growth Assurance Framework, and the exemptions can be found at Appendix 3 of the report. These exemptions specifically concern the business board, and I have been informed by the business board manager that he wrote to the area lead and central team on 25th of February this year to inform them that the LEP business board was currently operating under the gender balance exemption with a slight drop below 1/3 of female representation. There is one private sector board vacancy for a female member, and recruitment is currently ongoing and expected to be concluded by May 2022. Officers at the CPCA also undertook a review of the local assurance framework as part of its compliance to review this document annually. Officers have updated key areas which are either outdated or required further clarity. Section 2.5 of the report highlights the key amendments and revisions, which I don't propose to read out, but I will touch upon the changes broadly, so please note the following. So, reference to the Mayor's Sustainable Growth Ambition Statement has been left in the draft, although it's subject to approval of the Combined Authority Board this month. As both the Local Assurance Framework and the Mayor's Sustainable Growth Ambition Statement will be presented at the CA Board, the draft will be amended to reflect the outcome of the decision accordingly. Following the Combined Authority Board on the 27th of October 2021, the recommendations approved at Board included climate change assessment. This is to be included in the project initiation document, also as part of the business case development and procurement criteria. With regards to the business board, the draft local assurance framework reflects recommendations approved at their meeting of 14th of September 2021, which covers the requirement for business board members meetings to be carried out in public, and also reflects broadening of the business board membership to include trade unions and business representative organisations. You will further note there is an option to extend the term of the office for chair and vice chair for a further 3 years in exceptional circumstances if approved by the board. This is in line with the exemption issued to the National Local Growth Assurance Framework. Finally, the adult education budget section has been updated to reflect current decision-making processes and also includes the CPCA's wider reporting and monitoring obligations. At present time, the CPCA is undergoing a governance review and constitutional review. We will also await further guidance from the government following the LEP review. Taking these points into consideration, the local assurance framework will require further revision in the near future. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Rina. That's not easy to do remotely, introduce something so complicated as that, so well done. Before I ask colleagues to whether they have any comments or questions, in your opinion, how much of this is simply bureaucratic housekeeping, and what are actually any material or substantial changes in there that we need to have in mind?
From my point of view, the changes that have been made are very, very minor. And like I said at the beginning, these are changes that were made just to clarify certain areas on the national level. I see Jodie's also joined the call. So I don't think there's any material changes at present, but if Jodie, if you have anything else to add.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, committee. Just to back up what Rina has set out to you there, but also just to add, part of the governance, well, the review of governance and ways of working, one involved me having a review of the assurance framework, but from a different perspective to see what opportunities there are to potentially improve the framework and develop it further, and to make sure it's future proofed for future opportunities and devolution. But as I said, that work has not taken place.
Thank you very much. So with those thoughts in mind, I open the floor to comments. David Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. Mike, partly reminding people who were here last year and partly for the benefit of those who weren't here last year, we spent an awful lot of time going through the local assurance framework last year. So I'm not surprised that the changes this year are fairly modest because we did a lot of revising last year.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Chair. Reading through the local assurance framework, I was concerned that it was very much concentrating on business cases and investments, and I just wonder if it's fit for purpose in terms of some of the work we're now getting involved in, and whether once the business case is approved, it's actually assuring that the business case is then delivered. Sorry to bore the committee, but certainly in terms of housing, the business case for HIF, the Housing Infrastructure Fund, wasn't followed through, for instance, to the housing strategy. And we obviously have major issues with that. And in the end, the government cut the programme short. So are there gaps in there in terms of non-business case work? Because I've looked on the government website in terms of local assurance frameworks, and I just feel we've only got part of it in there. Maybe I'm missing a trick on this. Thanks.
Before our remote colleagues comment, Robert Parkin wants to say something.
Yeah, thanks. I know it's a very good question, isn't it? Looking at the document, it does obviously it takes cases through. If we just remind ourselves what the assurance frameworks are for, they're about mechanisms for the various parties, so the business board, the accountable body, the combined authority and central government can be assured that money is being spent in the right way and the right things. Ensuring good collaboration and setting out the governance arrangements and responsibilities. It stops there, but actually if we look at the document itself, it does talk about delivery. So part 6 is about the delivery phase, performance reporting. So there is clearly a component, and risk management as well, which is clearly about the sort of the processes of gauging effectiveness and highlighting concerns as a project delivers. I think it's a very important challenge, and perhaps we could sort of take away and reflect on this. I don't know how that could be best reported back to the committee, but to look into whether we're satisfied that site. I'm just trying to think about the best way we can sort of test that. But for me, there is something on delivery here. Whether that's fully effective, I couldn't sort of comment without sort of further testing, which is probably more of an audit piece rather than a me sitting here piece.
Thank you. And before I go to remote, John, Chief Finance Officer, wants to say something.
Sorry, just to say that as part of the documents, if you might remember, that was set up at the very beginning of the life of the combined authorities, alongside the assurance framework, there was also the monitoring and evaluation framework. And that is set up in order to monitor what the combined authority does, and that largely feeds into the, as we mentioned earlier on, the 5-yearly gateway reviews, which determine whether we get the next tranche of funding. So a lot of that would be covered in the monitoring and evaluation framework.
Thank you. Now, can I just ask?
Well, can I just pose?
Could I just ask your first question that people?
I just wanted to give some examples of that.
Could I just ask for the reaction from and then we'll take any follow-up. Jodie or Rena, do you want to say anything?
Well, nothing further to add to that. Thank you.
Okay,
No, nothing to add.
yours.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose an example would be a road scheme, which is a start and finish type thing, and bus franchising, which would be, I don't know, 20, 30 years. I don't know how long it would last for, but so there's very different animals there. And obviously, as I keep on repeating, the nature of the business is changing, and perhaps we need to review the local assurance framework in that light to make sure that it is fit for purpose when we're sort of delivering non-capital, if you like, which is what we would be in terms of bus franchising, for instance.
Jodie, do you have any comments on those last remarks?
Apologies, it's hard to comment on that, having not reviewed your assurance framework at present, and I'd be loath to sort of provide a view about having gone through it in detail, but it's something I can take into account when undertaking that review.
Okay, thank you. And in some ways, these are very nuanced debates because, to me, some documents like the assurance framework or a plan, the concerns about whether we delivered the plan is something that we use Audit and others to establish. And from my military background, I know that no plan survives first contact with reality, and that's why we have the audit process. But I'm grateful that you'll take on the points raised by Councillor Sargent for when you're doing your review. Thank you. Any other comments? Are we content to approve and recommend this amended draft to the Combined Authority Board? Right. Thank you. And we note that the Business Board is going to chew on their exemptions in a few days' time. Thank you. And thank you, Rena.
Thank you.
So now is your spot, Jodie, to introduce the update on the review of governance and ways of working. And our task is to note progress made since January. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, committee. As the Chair just set out, I'm here to give you an update on the review of governance and ways of working, which is set out in the report that's been tabled. Since January, since the last came on January 28th, a number of actions have taken place. We've had our interview session with the Chair of the Business Board, which was a very interesting conversation discussing the role of the Business Board and how it interacts with the governance framework. We fed a significant amount of evidence into the Combined Authorities business transformation work around the CA's purpose and strategic objectives. A lot of that evidence gained from the conversations we held with the Mayor and all of the constituent leaders and chief executives, which I believe has been very worthwhile. We've also taken part in a Business Board strategy and workshop, following on from the devolution white paper and future role in the Combined Authority. We've held an interview with the Chair of the Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership on relationships and roles and how the two can potentially work together in the future. We've completed our benchmarking with other CAs on their governance structures and the reasoning behind why they have those particular structures. I'd like to just draw your attention to 3.5 of the report. On 23rd of February, we had a meeting with the Mayor and leaders as part of their LSM meeting, where we took them through some initial findings from the governance review, but this was around governance framework. And we've highlighted there some of those key points that we discussed around the CA board, around the strategic roles, around the roles, informal governance roles and mechanisms that may be available to the Mayor and leaders, which we refer to as policy space, around economic growth, exec committees, and the overview and scrutiny function. As a result of those conversations at LSM, there was an agreement from the Mayor and leaders on a number of key principles to help inform the governance review moving forward, which are set out at 3.6. Running through those briefly, the principle of a more focused, less frequent CA board based around a bi-monthly cycle that is supported by a strategy and growth forum made up, of course, of the Mayor and leaders. looking to use leaders' time more efficiently and effectively, having the CA board more focused on strategic plans and objectives, making sure we explore wider delegations to the exec committees, but also enable those exec committees to use and utilise their existing delegations. There's an ask to look into the issue of role of lead members, and make sure that we have consistent and clear supporting and consultation arrangements to be developed with our constituent council officers, members and stakeholders, and obviously to continue the work of the governance review. All those key principles are going to be very helpful in taking us through in the next steps of which are outlined in 3.11. The main element of those next steps is we are beginning the second round of conversations with the mayor and constituent leaders. In those conversations, we'll be testing some of the initial conclusions from the governance review to date. We'll be looking to test potential options for governance framework and structure moving forward based on the evidence received to date. We will be looking then to obviously pull together our final governance review report. The next steps there refers to a March or April LSM meeting for the draft of that to come through. It's more likely to be the April meeting or beyond at this moment in time. And then obviously that final report will come through to the CA board. I will just add that we will be looking to have a further conversation with the chair of Audit and Governance Committee as part of this review, and to sort of explore in that conversation if there is a requirement or there's an opportunity to engage the wider committee in regards to some of the elements that have come up in the governance review, such as potential role of audit and governance around oversight of application of the assurance framework on projects and where they are in that delivery stage or development stage. So that's a brief overview. Happy to answer any questions or queries from committee members.
Thank you very much, Jody. David Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, Jody. Just on the next steps, 3.11, I would have thought, I was a bit surprised that we're not in there, that we should have, the draft report should be coming to this committee somewhere between its consideration at the Leaders' Strategy meeting and then its final presentation to the Combined Authority Board.
Thank you, Councillor. If I mean, and that is one of the bullets I have down for my conversation with the chair about how we best go about doing that. Whether that's something we bring to you as a committee, or whether we look to have maybe an informal session or conversation. But I can assure you that it's very much on the radar.
I think that's a yes. Then it will come to us in one form or another, and Jody and I'll just discuss timings. Mike?
Yeah, I'm interested, Jody, in 3.9 because it's saying the Audit and Governance Committee should have more of a role in oversight of the assurance framework, which I think you referenced, and deliver more project oversight, which sounds like quite a bit of extra work. Would that be delivered by something like the internal auditors to report back to us, or would we have officer resource, or how would it work? Have you had any thoughts about that?
Good.
So on that's more a reflection of a theme that's been raised during the conversations with council leaders about whether there is or is not a role for the Audit and Governance Committee to test application of the assurance framework by looking at projects as they're being delivered, and to see where they are in the development or in the sort of life cycle set out by the assurance framework, and to what extent the assurance framework is being appropriately applied. It is a conversation to have. It is right at the top of my conversation about how we go about exploring that when I speak to the chair of your committee. Just to reflect back on that, so I'm aware that other combined authorities do that through their relevant audit and governance committee. They seek to test whether the assurance framework is being appropriately applied by having an oversight role on where projects are, and seeing where they are in regards to assurance being delivered, and whether the assurance framework is being appropriately followed. So that will be the sort of the basis of that conversation. But it's something that hasn't been developed at this stage, Councillor.
Thank you, Jody. Before I move on, Robert Parkin wants to make a comment on that point.
Yeah, I think it's clear, but it's well identified. I just wanted to. There is a distinction. So, and Jody's text, I think does support this. That the Audit and Governance Committee is about process protocol. So the role is looking at the assurance framework to ensure that it can identify opportunities to deliver more project oversight, not necessarily itself carry out that oversight, because of course oversight performance is a matter for a number of or sort of organs, as it were, within the combined authority, not least the scrutiny committee. It's looking at what's our template, what's our framework. The doing of the looking at the projects would be for other elements of the combined authority.
I'll come back to you, Graham.
Thank you, Chair. In the previous paper or agenda item, it said that all business board meetings would be held in public unless the chairman decided that they need to be held in private. But in 3.5, second bullet, it says about strategic development, it says the combined authority members need better forums for debating strategy, direction, vision and key policy in a trusted and private space, implying to me that these will be in private. And these are just the sort of things that I thought we'd been fighting for, needed to have a discussion in public. So could somebody explain why we seem to, on the face of it, going back on what I thought we had fought for some time?
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, very important point. So there's no, and this goes back to the external auditor's report that talked about good governance and that being slightly nebulous, but of course good governance is about fully informed decisions, including a comprehensive understanding of all of the alternative options. There's nothing in these proposals which would seek to avoid the proper presentation to all participants in a decision, and that's not just that those people who are elected members making the decision, but any stakeholder, so you know, electors, people in the area, and businesses. So a report and a decision-making process should always be comprehensive in its treatment of options and opportunities, but that doesn't mean that it's not still highly productive to have a development space so that understanding and consensus can be developed among those who need to find consensus, such as board members, to propel, you know, initiatives forward. So it's a really important point, and I think we, you know, officers in putting this together have got that responsibility to ensure that those environments don't, you know, that they don't damage the need for transparency, clarity, and public accountability in the decisions, whilst, you know, balancing the desire to have a private space for development of ideas. So I think there's a really key responsibility there. But there is, you know, by this report and by the evidence that Jodie's gathered through his review, an appetite to create that.
Jodie, did you have any comments to make that before I move on?
Yeah, just to support everything Robert's just said there, and just said that this is based around the supporting activity that we need to have in place to support the boards and committees of the combined authority that exist in its governance structure. So it's not about making any of those conversations or that decision making happen in a non-public forum. It's about creating the correct and appropriate forums where politicians can perhaps have some of the difficult strategic development conversations, and that is something that has been evidenced so far in the governance review, the feeling that we don't quite have that as we refer to policy space in place at the moment. And if I can reassure the committee, that existing policy space is something that has been developed and in existence at all other combined authorities, as I'm aware of, and has made a real positive impact in helping inform strategic development within the combined authority. So it's in full support of everything that Robert has just said.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're just coming back to 3.9. I mean, it'd be really interesting to see what other combined authorities do in that sort of space, because it's obviously very significant in terms of the operation of the combined authority, and you know, if we can learn from other people, so much the better.
Thank you. Peter Fane.
Thank you, Chair. I was very interested in what Jodie said about meeting with the GCP, Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership, to review working methods. I think I may have missed that in the report. It is, of course, an area of great scope for overlap and misunderstanding, bearing in mind the nature of the local governments with a number, but not all of the councils in the area, collaborating together on both policy and delivery through GCP. I'm just wondering to what extent, I mean, there are a number of areas of possible overlap here, and I don't know how extensive the discussions were, but for instance, to what extent would you have expected assurances from GCP, who have their own policy on transport, that they will take into account the current review and consultation on the local transport and communications plan, rather than proceeding with their own on perhaps a separate track?
Jodie?
So the first thing I would say is the conversation I had, which was with the Chief Executive of Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership, was an incredibly positive conversation. A lot of the conversation was based around what each organisation can do to support each other's governance mechanisms. It was about making sure that both organisations had an understanding of role and purpose and what their objectives are, and then hopefully from that subsequently would come opportunities where both organisations could work together, potentially moving forward. There was a lot of conversation, I think it's fair to say, about how both organisations could potentially work together more positively. And a lot of this linked into some of the conversation we've been having in the governance review with all people we've interviewed around our informal governance mechanisms. So the bodies that we have that sit under our boards and committees, where we're really engaging with our constituent members and bodies like Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership to help develop conversations, potential policy, all of which can then feed upwards into boards committees to then help deliver those strategic plans that have been agreed and developed by the combined authority. Obviously, there's some things there to develop. But that was basically the sort of the focus of the conversation with Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership, and that just end that by saying the conversation was very well received, and that has been passed on to the LSM meeting when we updated them.
Thank you. I don't see any other comments. Before closing off, you've used the word strategy quite a few times. In your report, you use the strategic role of overview and scrutiny. The trouble is that it's not always easy to stick with strategy, because we like to know a lot more about the stuff we actually know about. We have in our earlier work got some impression that there was concern about the absence of a strategy and sense of purpose for the combined authority. And I wondered, when you were doing the work so far, whether that was your impression.
Thank you, Chair. So a lot of the early conversations I had evidence gathering with the Mayor and leaders, which initially was to be focused on governance framework. I think it's fair to say consistently ended up initially being around the role and purpose of the combined authority. So that gave us a lot of opportunity to take evidence from those parties to feed into the piece of work the Chief Executive is leading in regards to transformation at the CA and establishing clearly the role and purpose. Those conversations, the feedback I received, a lot of that was about clarity on the purpose and clarity on the role. And then once we provided that clarity, what we can then do moving forward. I think we fed a lot of evidence from the review into that transformation piece of work. And a lot of this then links into the golden thread conversation, which is something that came up in every conversation I had with council leaders and the Mayor about establishing our golden thread. What is our purpose? What is our vision? What are our objectives? And then making sure that we have a governance framework that is fit for purpose to enable delivery of those of that vision, that purpose, and that objectives. And I think it's fair to say that the evidence taken from those first round of conversations was that there was a feeling there was work to be done to make sure we could do that. Well, I think we're at a stage now where where we need to get a better understanding of what the objectives are moving forward, so that we can properly draft out and shape what the governance framework potentially could be to best support that. I hopefully that answers your question, Chair.
It gives me an insight anyway. I think more work to be done is what I'll take away from that. Robert Parkin.
Well, just to offer assurance, it's certainly, and Jodie's work's feeding into it, but of course the governance review will not define purpose and priority, but that work is absolutely underway. It's considerable energy and time being spent, led on by Chief Executive, with members of the CA board and also officers to develop a statement of purpose and to create an organisation which reflects that. So that's absolutely work that's underway, and as we move forward with the governance review, that it'll sort of fall into line, and no doubt be. I'm just looking at forward plan, but that the outputs of that transformation work will no doubt be reported through the CA board at the right time, and no doubt very soon.
Thank you, Robert. I note your optimism, and I think it is something important to us that good governance and ways of working, because it's both, is if it's much harder to take a scrutiny role if there's a lack of clarity about aims, purpose and strategy. So I think we should welcome that this work is going on, because it will not only lead to a better performing combined authority, but it will give us greater clarity and where we see the importance to probe and ask questions. Thank you, Jodie. I look forward to talking to you in your next engagement round, and I can assure members that the draft proposals will come to this committee on their way to the blessing. Thank you. So we now move on to, he loses it. Item 11, the Climate Working Group, Terms of Reference, and Adrian Cannard is joining us to take us through the paper. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Chair. Yes, so you have in front of you the terms of reference of the Climate Working Group. As to note, it's had 3 meetings along with 3 meetings of its officer support group, and as set out, it has met its objective, which is to report a strategy through to the March board. So on the agenda for the March board will be a climate action plan based on the recommendations of the working group. We will obviously be publishing those papers in due course as part of the board paper pack, and in somewhat sort of a change to the original idea around the climate working group, we've had to obviously accelerate their work to fit into that timetable set by the board, and so they're going to look at their future meeting cycle might be subsequent to that. So the report is to note terms of reference and progress to date.
Mike?
Thanks, Adrian. It's not really around terms of reference, but more about how we make sure across the combined authority area that there's perhaps some sort of commonality in approach, so it's easier for the working group to really assess what's going on. So I know my own council, Cambridge City Council, has got its own approach to methodology, for instance, assessment of how things are progressing. So any thoughts on that? And I suppose the other big issue for me is with the combined authority, of course, that we've got to show some leadership on this. So I note the Green Book has changed, and increasingly we have to look more at climate impact, for instance. So, you know, I think all local authorities need to make sure that they've got appropriate measures in to evaluate projects such that have a positive effect on climate change rather than negative effect. Have you been looking at that yet?
Thank you. So 2 points there. So the first point on the sort of methodologies and the technical approach. So we have a officer group that brings together all the local authorities so that we can share work on that, and we are drawing from the same government data sets in terms of overall emissions. So there is a commonality around approach there, but we're certainly looking to share best practice amongst the authorities as part of the convening role. On the second aspect, so we've changed the committee report templates to board that they now have under the significant implications section a explicit section on climate, so that all reports where relevant will identify the climate implications. And we have been working with procurement to look at how we can embed climate weighting into future procurement approaches to make that a consistent approach. And again, that's one of the topics we're also discussing with not just local authorities, but other public sector authorities, so that suppliers are asked for a very consistent set of measures to enable the supply chain to respond better.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I've got a couple. Adrian, thank you very much for the paper. I see that on page 91, it says the Climate Working Group is an alliance and a collaboration, not a separate organisation. And I did observe, I think it was the first time the Combined Authority Board took the recommendations that led to where we are now. And the debate was quite robust within the Combined Authority Board. I didn't see a lot of meeting of minds on a collaborative approach. Now, that was about 18 months ago. Is it genuinely a collaboration? And have we now got a common view across the many stakeholders?
So I think obviously we will see when we get the report at board, the decision making through the board. All local authorities are addressing climate change. I think obviously there is a lot of debate around individual measures and the impact on communities. And one of the key topics that has been coming up is around people's ability to afford the adaptation measures that we need and how we can help our communities. So there are a variety of approaches that can be taken. And what we've tried to do through the work on the Climate Action Plan is identified shared themes, and there will be different approaches to be taken in different local areas. So I think everyone is very aligned to dealing with these really challenging issues. Obviously, the implementation might be different depending on local circumstances, and that could vary from urbanized areas through to rural areas, having different transport abilities to respond through to how we run our public services. So there will be differences in delivery.
I've just got one question, Adrian. Are the representatives from the various sectors officer representatives or members? And if they're all, as I suspect, officers, why is the chief executive not chairing this group and then reporting to the board rather than the mayor?
So the working group is a mixture of members from local authorities and senior executives from the sector. So we did invite from the non-exec side of authorities, of organisations, to provide representation. Obviously, in some cases, they have delegated that through to officers within their organisations. So there are members on the climate working group, and the mayor takes a keen interest in pushing that agenda forward and was keen to chair the meeting.
Thank you. How do you think the Audit and Governance Committee can assist in this process? Or don't you think we can?
It's probably one for the ongoing review that you've been discussing with Jodie in terms of the governance and audit. Obviously, we're happy to bring the progress to both this and the Overall Scrutiny Committee, which we will be doing this month on those aspects. And as we look at delivery, obviously the governance around the individual projects will need to follow our processes as well. We will be looking at, as part of the business plan, the monitoring of our progress against climate objectives, and so that will be subject to your usual scrutiny of that process.
Thank you. Not an easy question to have to answer. You answered it very well. It does strike me that there's so many players in this piece that it's a great challenge for the combined authority to be able to make some forward momentum in a harmonised way. And I suppose, in my mind, the role of this committee is to understand the methods is being used to try and achieve progress across the whole of the community. So I'd very much like to take your offer up of a progress report, say in 6 months' time, focused on achievements against the plan and bringing to our attention any challenges in the terms of process and methodologies for this working group. Not about the decisions, because that's not our point of view. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good example, Chair, of what I brought up under the internal audit plan for the future, because I think the role of the combined authority is changing, and this is more a convening and facilitating role. And I think I sort of issued the challenge, if you like, as to whether internal audit should be involved or anything else. And I think we probably need a review, Chair, of all these changes and how we interact with them. Really.
Okay, thank you. Step by step, I think, at the moment. So bearing in mind the point that Councillor Flodgen has just made about the facilitation aspect of what the combined authority is evolving, it would be very good in your next report to focus on those. What are the processes? What are the obstacles? Again, we are not in this committee concerned with the goodness or badness of decisions. What we need to understand is the governance and how it is operating. Is that clear, or do you have any questions about that remit?
You've given a clear steer there. Obviously, I will work with colleagues on audit and the governance review to align with that work, and we'll report back to you as you suggest.
Thank you very much. So we've noted and well, we welcomed and noted the report. Thank you very much. We're coming up for 2 hours. We've got about 4 or 5 things to do. Do we want to plough on, or do we want a leg stretch? Plough on? Okay, so the next one is item 12, which are financial strategies. And we are asked to review and comment on the investment strategy for 22-23 and note and review in-year performance against the indicators of prudence. And Robert Emery is going to introduce his report.
Thank you, Chair. As you've said, this report's sort of in two parts, so if you're happy with it, I'll pause after I've spoken about the investment strategy to give members a chance to ask about that before moving on to the reporting on the indicators. Members would be forgiven for having a sense of deja vu at this point, because you'll have remembered I was talking to you about these strategies only in your January meeting. Following that meeting, a discussion with our Treasury Management advisors, we've expanded the section on equity investments to provide further detail on that class of investments. While the draft that was presented to the committee in January does fulfil the requirements for a local authority's investment strategy, so would have been fully compliant, our advisors suggested that for further detail be added, as equities make up a much larger element of the combined authority's investment portfolio than is usual for a more traditional local authority. Along with a relatively high proportion of equity investment, we also make investment in private companies, including high-risk startups, which is very unusual for a local authority in its normal operation of delivering services to the public. In light of that, we've included greater detail on the controls that we have in place around that to insulate the combined authority from the risks of investments in those areas. That's really the summary of it. There's no fundamental change to underlying policies and procedures. Everything that's in that strategy was already in place. It's just providing more detail to the readers of the strategies and the committee so that they can better understand how we are properly protecting the authority.
Thank you. Shall we take the first part of that harmony? Any questions, comments? Mike.
I think I've got the right section here. So on page 99, you note the lower returns compared with other local authorities, or more traditional local authorities, shall I say. Can you give us a bit more detail as to the reasons and whether there are lessons learned there that we ought to embrace?
So that's actually reflecting our treasury management investments, which is just cash given out as loans to address the difference between when we get money in and when we spend it. That's not reflecting a rate of return on service investments such as equity investments. Would you like me to answer your question now or after I've talked about it? Because I can address it.
Understood. Hopefully I've got a question and hopefully it's in the right place. No, I've just lost it. No, on, because it does say strategy, so that must be good because it's in, so paragraph 4.15 on page 100. It says, in line with the strategy and the long-term cash flow forecast, we've been discussing, officers have been discussing options for diversifying some balances available for longer term investments to get more return. Now, this has been, in the 5 years I've been involved with this is from a layman's point of view, we've been getting miserable returns and at our behest, you had an external review and took their advice, which wasn't in the layman's way as exciting as hope. But one of the arguments for being so prudent was that the authority had very little understanding in the early years of its demands on cash because it didn't know what the projects were, and so every year we got this as the, well, we don't know what's happening, so we have to be very prudent and be ready to do whatever. Do I detect now that you're beginning to get some sort of investment profile or expenditure profile which allows you to bank some of this stuff long term in more productive places? And is this the right part of your speech?
It's actually also about the treasury management strategy. But I'll answer the question now anyway, because so that's more reflecting on our current treasury management strategy, although next year's is very similar. Yes and no. So we are obviously better understanding our cash flows now than we were 5 years ago, but as Councillor Sargent has repeatedly said this meeting, we are still undergoing constant change. over the past 4 years, we've had significant capital funds from government in terms of housing, the Transforming Cities Fund, and the Local Growth Fund. All of those are now ending, and their successor fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, is expected to be awarded over the summer. We don't know how much that will be, and we don't know what projects the government is looking for us to bring forward as part of that. So while we are getting a greater understanding of our operational cash flows, the caution I would give, and what's still probably going to hold us back potentially, is that to make these sort of longer term investments, we need to know what are the cash we're never going to drop below, basically, that we can afford to lock up for multiple year periods. And there's 2 graphs later in the report that show our treasury management performance to the end of December and one to December 2021. And that really highlights how important being able to lock in investments of this sort for a long period is. If we'd had to liquidate those investments in December 2021, which is the second graph, that huge negative tail on the right-hand side shows that actually if we'd taken our money out at that point, we'd have lost significant amounts of the money we put in. We'd have had a negative return. If we want to make these strategic investments, we need to be able to ride out bumps in the market and not have to draw down those funds at inopportune moments. And the ability to do that with only 5 years of operation and with continually changing plans and project portfolios means that we are being continuously very prudent. So we are hopeful to move some money into that, but it will still probably make up a relatively small element of our overall investment portfolio.
Thank you. I think it's very helpful to be reminded of the context in which these decisions have been made. I'd be grateful if you could hone a few words for the minutes that encapsulate what you've just told us, because we need to remind ourselves that this isn't about looking at one's own savings account and wondering whether you should take it out or leave it on. It's much more complicated, and it's getting an insight into those underlying complications is helpful for context. Okay. Graham.
I don't pretend to understand this at all, Robert, and I think when it comes to a vote, I'll have to abstain because I don't understand. But I thought from reading the press, where I get my sources of information, that you don't put money into volatile funds, asset classes, if you're likely to need that money within 5 years, say. So from what John has said about, well, we expect to get certain chunks of money from the government every year, that is matched with an expectation that we are doing something with that. So 2 questions really. Why on earth should we be putting it somewhere where there's quite a significant risk of losing money when we're going to need it, and this negative tail that you've talked about? And secondly, are we confident that the government is also happy with the investment strategy that you're proposing here?
So I'll first talk about the 2 differences between the investment strategy and the treasury management strategy. The investment strategy covers service investments where the primary outcome is delivering jobs, GVA growth, or any service that a local authority is looking for. They can and will reasonably be higher risk because they're equivalent to spending money on delivering a service. Treasury management, on the other hand, there is law requiring us to look after the capital and the liquidity of the organisation before considering the return. So those treasury ones that are just there to effectively hold our money until we need it, because government's given it a bit, some of it to us in advance, they're the ones where we'll go for very low risk options, and they're the ones where we're potentially considering putting a small amount of money in for a long term. And that would only be if we can identify that we are consistently having a gap between when we get our funding and when we need it, so that we're not forced to draw down at an inopportune moment. The service investments that the investment strategy is talking about, we actually, in an abundance of prudence, have not modelled any returns from that. So to insulate the combined authority from these higher risk investments, we've said in future we're getting nothing back from any of those. Now, we don't expect that to be the case. We expect to get money back from them, but we're not planning it. If the worst happened and we didn't get anything back, the ongoing stability of the organisation wouldn't be affected. And that's the absolute backstop that we've put in place for these high-risk investments in start-up companies. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of, but you can see the glazed eyes. But it does imply that you're investing money and you're suggesting that you may not get that money back, which then is a write-off and a potential waste of public money. It's one way of interpreting what you've just said, I think. I accept it's a relatively small amount of money, and because these are small startups that we're hoping to support, and we might be doing it for the common good, but in terms of return on public money, that doesn't sound like good prudence. But I may be interpreting this incorrectly, John.
You are fundamentally correct. There is a risk with these investments that public money will have gone into the company and there won't be a financial return. The objective of, let's take one as example, the Illumina Fund, where we're making £100,000 investments into startup biotech companies, those are risky. We're making 30 as part of a programme. Some of them are likely to fail. Others are likely to succeed. And it's that balance of risk that when the project was presented to the business board and then the combined authority board, they chose to accept. I would say when considering the service investments, it's worth keeping in mind that the comparator I would use is more giving a grant to an organisation to deliver something, rather than treasury management where you're looking for a financial return. You need your money back. These are more akin to us giving money to a company in the hopes or intention that it will grow and create more jobs, in the same way we might give a grant to the same company to build an incubator site to generate more jobs. So you are absolutely correct, they are at risk, but there is good reason behind that thinking, and it has been considered as part of the business case.
Robert. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I mean, would this, your risk to this, be something like the caveat that you get with every financial product, if there is actually such a thing, that your investment is at risk if you invest in this? And that's really what you're saying with this, that there is a risk to it, but you've got to balance that with the responsibility and duty of investing it somewhere, and it's the same caveat that you have with any financial product, that there is a risk that you can lose your capital with that, but if it's invested wisely, it usually doesn't. Would that be a fair understanding of that?
Yes, that is the fundamental principle. I would again stress the changes in the investment strategy and the high-risk investments are service deliverables, not our treasury management funding. It is effectively the spend we're given the money to do, rather than us looking after our money for the future. But yes, that is fundamentally the point. Your capital is at risk.
So as we're on this, I don't know which section we're in at the moment, but never mind. But as we're talking about service investments, so on page 117, so the heading in terms of service investment loans, in terms of contribution, does include to support the provision of affordable housing and to stimulate local economic growth and skills development. And then it goes on to talk about the revolving housing fund. And that was £40 million. And as I recall, at some stages, in terms of affordable housing, it was locking away perhaps £1 million or getting on for £1 million per affordable house. So what do we have in place to make sure that what we loan is, if you like, a reflection of what we signed up to for the devolution deal, or any subsidiary business cases, or anything else, to make sure that we are prioritising against the devolution deal and not locking away in something which isn't quite delivering on that?
So that's more of a strategy decision. So that would be the board ultimately take that decision. Their decision making has to follow what's set out in the assurance framework, which they agree to on an annual basis. So these strategies really set out the framework within which they make their decisions, but ultimately the decision on strategy and where money should be invested within those strategies is for the board.
Would you like to take us through the second bit that we haven't already covered inadvertently? And then we ought to pause after that and just think about the lamentable failure of us to comprehend much of this and what we're going to do about it.
Thank you, Chair. The second element of the report is how we've been doing this year against the indicators that are set in the Treasury Management and Capital Strategy. Rather than take every single indicator, there are many of them and most of them have been complied with, I'll just focus on the areas where there's exceptions. There have been 2 areas of non-compliance since in the current financial year. The first, both due to funds coming through relating to the Green Home Energy Grant, which really shows just how big that money is compared to the General Combined Authority's other programmes. The first indicator that was exceeded is the amount of cash kept in liquid investments. This is generally limited to limit our exposure to short-term changes in interest rates. So we're encouraged to, where we're not going to need money for, say, 6 months, put that money away partially in fixed-term loans for 6 months so that if interest rates spike, or more problematically for us, dip, we're not exposed to that risk. Because we've had £200 million from government across 2 phases of the Green Homes Energy Grant, all of which has to be spent within the next 13 months, we're not actually able to make very long-term deals and put that money away because we need to spend it in the short term. That is expected to continue to be the case for the next 13 months as we deliver this project. There is potentially even a further phase beyond that, but we won't have clarity around that until over the summer. If that future phase does come in, if it continues to be such large quantities of money, we will need to review this performance indicator in year. Otherwise, I'll just be here every time telling you we've exceeded it, at which point there's not much point in the indicator. The second indicator is the individual limits with counterparties, which is indicator 1. This is set so that if any individual entity, be it a bank or another local authority, went under, we would limit the amount of money the combined authority would lose because they're holding that money for us. This is normally set to £25 million, which is the amount of money we usually have just to make our monthly and weekly payments out to our suppliers. On one weekend in December, this was somewhere more like £120 million. The counterparty in question is our regular bank, Barclays, so it's relatively reputable and stable, and this was due to 113 million being provided by a government department, and they were unable to tell us which day we would be receiving it in advance, which meant we couldn't arrange for fixed-term loans with local authorities to get the money out again. As it turned out, we got it after 3 PM on that day, which is the cut-off to give money to the Debt Management Office, which is our usual go-to for depositing large amounts of money overnight. So we did end up with significantly more than we should have had with our bank over the weekend. We subsequently invested that on the Monday after we received it, so it was a very short-term risk. And obviously, Barclays haven't gone under, the risk didn't materialise, and it's not an ongoing risk to the organisation or a flaw in our processes. It's an unfortunate reality of government not being able to tell us exactly when they're going to give us large sums of money. I can count, if there are any questions on those, I'm happy to take them, or I can talk about the performance in terms of our Treasury management income, which will come back to the Councillor's previous question.
I don't see any other questions. Is what you've got to tell us now satisfactory, good or appalling? The next bit, is it good, satisfactory or appalling?
I think it would be inarguable to say it's anything other than poor. I would say our overall portfolio, not including the £90 million that was held with the Debt Management Office, is satisfactory. However, that 113 million I was previously talking about, as mentioned, we're not allowed to hold that in our bank account. And so without prior warning and the ability to arrange fixed term better rate loans, the vast majority of that funding was put with the Debt Management Office. The rates they offer, because they're zero risk, it is government, are incredibly low, as can be seen in the table in the report. And that very large chunk of money at those very low rates has pulled down our average treasury management rate substantially. Over the next 6 months, that money will come back in and will be invested in higher interest rate fixed term loans or used to fund the Green Homes project as it delivers. And so I expect our average rate to go back to being satisfactory over the next 6 months. But I can't say anything other than that has significantly lowered our average rate. And it was unfortunately unavoidable.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other? It just seems to me, I've always found this topics rather a good antidote to insomnia, but I think the fact that we really, many of us haven't got our mind round it, says that we perhaps need to go with, remind ourselves what our function is as a committee and trying to find a way into it where we can actually add value and make you uncomfortable. So what I would suggest to colleagues that early in the next civic year, we have a development session where we try and understand what are the principles that we're trying to grapple with and find a way which gives us an insight where we can actually give some serious comment rather than uncertainty about which bit of the paperwork we should be reading. So are we happy to do that basis? Because this doesn't leave any of us feeling comfortable that we're getting traction, to use your word, on what is in here and what we should be doing to help. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, at Cambridge City Council, when we come to Treasury Management and it comes to full council, well, there's no debate really, it's nodded through and everything else, because it's obviously a very stable situation year on year. And I think the thing we're particularly grappling with is the nature of the combined authority expenditure and funding and everything else. So it would be useful to have some comparators when we do that, perhaps with other combined authorities, or I suppose that's the main. I mean, I suppose the Greater Cambridge Partnership might be another example, but you know, it's so foreign to me in terms of the challenges you've got.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's a good point. Some comparators. So a development session to get underneath this and understand our role and how we can, and maybe yourselves could give us information which is more honed to what our function is rather than too much detail. Thank you. I never thought I'd say that. Sorry, Sue Hall is going to introduce the information governance update, and we are to note the update and note and comment on any of the information on FOI and EIR and whistleblowing activity. Sue, are you ready?
Yes, good afternoon, members. Good morning, sorry. I just wanted to prepare a report on information governance, and it's just an update really on where we're at with everything. So if you've got any questions, by all means ask, but it's just an update.
How do you think performance is, Sue?
Yes, in terms of all the policies, they've all been implemented. We've had trained the whole of the company in the last couple of weeks on the new policies. We've also carried out some training on the data protection impact assessment forms. So that's gone well. We've got training for all staff on data protection, and any new members of staff are sent links within the first 2 weeks of them starting, and then they're chased every couple of weeks to make sure that they complete the training.
Thank you. I think Robert Parkin wants to add.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's obviously lots of information there in the report to do with specific actions that we took on to improve our performance around data protection, but also freedom of information. So if you look at page 2 of the report, you've got some updates there on what policies needed to be redesigned. We've got a staff training programme that's described, as Sue's referred to there. We have data privacy impact assessments. Those are documents which are applied to new activity to examine for sensitivities around the processing of data and to inform how that's done. Various other bits and pieces there. We have an information risk group meeting. We get support from the County Council's data protection officer by way of staff development and awareness, and that's working well. You'll see at 2.5 that we had 14 requests under the Freedom of Information Act, and actually also, I think there were only, and a reference there to one request under the Environmental Information Regulations. They were responded to within the specified time frame. There's a reference to no corporate complaints, and there's a reference there to a whistleblowing disclosure as well. Chair.
Any comments, questions?
I just wondered if Robert or Sue can send us any more about the whistleblowing disclosure, what we've learnt from that.
I will, before I ask Robert to talk, I should just make members aware, I've been aware of this that there was an event, I don't know what it is, but I've been counselled about, until now, not registering it in our domain because of the complexities of and confidentialities of the case. And I don't think, from what advice I've been given, I don't think it would be appropriate for us to look into what the case was, but I leave Robert to.
Yeah, that's quite right, Chair, and obviously it's reported in this standard document, but wouldn't otherwise be surfaced. The nature of whistleblowing complaints is that there needs to be protection around the process whilst it is in train. Once a process is completed, will be reported into the relevant committees, and in this instance it would be this committee. At the moment, I'm not able to give any comments, but I would say, watch this space. Members of the committee will be made aware at the appropriate time, and the reasons for, as I say, maintaining confidentiality, and my advice to the chair, who certainly has challenged me on this appropriately, has been that it's been extremely important to maintain the confidentiality of the fact that that's underway. It's reported here because actually it's near the end. And that we have these things referenced in this report, but it will be coming through to the committee in due course.
Thank you, Robert. Mike?
Yeah, I was shocked to see the damaged device policy in here. I don't know where that came from, and I've had laptops for 35 years probably, and staff with laptops, etc. I mean, surely this is totally disproportionate, and I once had a laptop that cost £5,000, I think. To expect a member of staff who we would be encouraging to use laptops because of all the different ways we work these days, we might be on trains, a whole range of things. Is there any evidence that there is lots of negligence? How many cases are there, and why have we got such a policy? I've never come across anything like this before in my life.
Yeah, so I mean, whether you have a policy or not, I think usage which goes beyond reasonable use or accident would always be something that an employer would look at. The policy is simply designed to highlight it to members of staff. there had been some significant damage to devices, and we took the decision around the IT management to look at bringing a policy in to remind officers and keep officers aware that use needs to be reasonable. Of course, it's not designed to chase after individuals who have reasonable accidents, but on the advice of our IT provider, when these policies are introduced, it acts as a positive reminder to treat devices with care. And you know, unfortunately, there are some individuals in the world who can be very, very negligent with things that are not theirs. But I'm certainly not saying that there's anyone in the combined authority of that nature, but on the advice of our IT team, it was something that would make sense to introduce, which is where it's come from.
I mean, this feels more a disciplinary issue, if you like, and there will be other things that you might do in a workplace which might break, damage, or whatever equipment. I mean, I guess we haven't got a damaged projector policy, for instance, so that wouldn't be included. And I just think it's totally disproportionate, and I think the normal ways of managing staff and discipline and all the other things will cover this, and I don't see the need for a specific in terms of these sorts of bits of equipment, which are essential these days, of course, for carrying out our work.
I don't think we should back this around. I think we registered the point. In the end, it's for management to decide. I'd ask them to reflect on your comments. I'd have a question if nobody else has got any more comments. I noticed that in common with other places, it talks about we received X FOI requests and Y environmental requests. And I assume that means that's because the member, whoever raised it, said this is an FOI request. But unless the situation has changed, I remember my horror when the legislation first came in, that it wasn't for the person who asked for the information to say what sort of request it was. It was for the organisation to answer any request that came in by any route. Does that legislation still pan out in that way, and is it a dilemma?
I can answer that. So, yeah, the legislation is the same. So it says that you don't have to sort of brandish the title FOI or Environmental Information Regulation request for it to be a request for information. Request for information is just that. It's do you have X, Y, Z? It's not. You know, in some instances, we'll often get correspondence which has FOI on the top, but actually will be a request for a position to be taken rather than actually for information itself, and that's slightly different. So the answer is that any request for information should be treated appropriately as an FOI request. Sometimes in the normal process of exchanging correspondence with third parties, they get what they request through the primary point of contact, so it doesn't go through the route of FOIs, I'm sure. But we do have a touch point for information requests. Whether it's an environmental information regulation request or a request under the Freedom of Information Act is actually just to do with the subject matter. So it has to be dealt with under the EIR, the Environmental Information Regulations, if it relates to specific topics touching upon the environment, so air, water, earth, habitats, and other things that affect the environment, emissions, radiation, noise and other forms of pollution. So that's to do with a substantive answer to the question of what type of information is it. If it is that, it goes under EIR. If it's, and there are some specific differences, which I'm afraid I can't say right now in terms of the treatment of that response. They're broadly the same, but there are some slight differences. And then for the rest of the information, it falls under the more general Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you, Robert. Any other comments? Thank you, Sue, for the report. and we'll get the next one. This is annual or 6 monthly? 6 months' time. Thank you very much. None of that came out. I'll do it again? No. Do people have any comments on the report, or do they, from the self-assessment questionnaire, have any thoughts on things we might focus on to improve ourselves in the next 12 months? Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say that from my perspective, whilst we're rotating around the county, it's very pleasant to see all these places. And because we haven't had the Combined Authority doesn't have a sort of office, I feel we've been sort of rotating, as I say, around the whole thing and not actually getting into the weeds of the organisation. And I find that a lot of what we say and do are difficult to I feel we're outside the organisation, not part of it, if I can put it as succinctly as that. And I think it's important that in the future this committee has more involvement in what goes on at wherever the headquarters is going to be. And to my mind, I do feel very detached from CPCA.
Does that resonate? Sorry, I'll put an extra point in the report to encapsulate that thought. It has been, from the beginning, a challenge for us, I think, that we're outside the organisation. I mean, I've been on a number of audit committees, and I've always been within that organisation, either as a non-executive director or as a director. And that's one of the reasons why we've established the practice that the chief executive comes every time to give us an update on activities, to give us some texture. But I think to try and bear in mind over the next 12 months where we might be able to increase our involvement. I mean, we had earlier the assurance framework and project delivery oversight. And you get, one is a good idea, but secondly, there's a lot of work involved if we would go down that route where we're more engaged. So if we could look for opportunities for engagement in a sensible way over the next 12 months, I think that would be very valuable. And I'll certainly raise it when I have my next one-to-one with Jodie, who's doing the ways of working review. Mike.
Yeah, I think Graham's absolutely right. And if you contrast it with a more traditional local authority, we would be on other committees, for instance, whether they're scrutiny or a decision-making committee or whatever it might be. So we are very involved in how the organisation operates. And because of the nature of the combined authority, that is very, very difficult for members to really get their teeth into, really. And I don't know how we address that. Obviously, we get the chief executive report, which gives us some aspect of what the combined authority is doing, but I'm not sure that's too relevant to our job, if you like. So, and we could obviously suggest that we all attend online the board meetings, the committee meetings, all those sort of things, but that's quite an onerous task for us, really. So it's certainly something I think we need to look at as to how we can try and improve that. But I've got no answers, I'm afraid.
I think you've summed up the dilemma. I think it's, and we've seen this with the new, we haven't actually seen it yet, but bringing directors to the risk management reports in future so we can talk to them. Those of us who are able to take part in the looking ahead session that we had with directors, we learned a lot from that in a way which certainly I'd not seen in the 4 years. So can we make that as an action on us, not only for me to amend our report, but to have a session in 6 months to take stock, and meanwhile to look and bear in mind opportunities to be greater engaged where it makes sense, and it isn't about box ticking or doing stuff to show we've done it. It's a matter of living and breathing it, isn't it? Okay, thank you. Well, I'll put the report forward to the board with those adjustments. And then we come to the work plan, which is the final item. Does anybody have any comments on the work plan? I just had a question before we ask for comments. Is it complete? Do you think it's got everything in it? And because I didn't see any development sessions, for instance.
No, no development sessions have been added yet, but the other work programmes should be up to date.
Does anybody have any?
Well, I think we've identified two, haven't we? Treasury management and, yeah.
I mean, as drafted, it's not mentioned. Robert, you wanted to speak? Yeah, so we have two items now that we have put in, and I would just ask members, those who go over the barrier into the next municipal year, if you ever think that there's an area where a development session would help, please let me know, because this is how we will get some of this better engagement as well. Okay, did you want to say anything? I always find it a bit tricky at this moment in time, because I don't really, not being a politician, I have no sense of the tapestry of what's going on out there in the next local elections. So for those, I'd like to thank you all for the year. For those who are not here next year, we'll see how we are all meet, to wish you well. And particularly to Graham Bull, it's because this is, are you departing?
Yes, this is my swan song. So I try to be quiet and good and not cause any trouble.
Okay, well, I wish you well, and thank you very much for all the advice and participation in this committee. Thank you, everybody. The next is at a place to be decided. In fact, just to go back, when you said a lot goes on and we move around a lot, but we're not close enough to it, I thought you were going to tell us you didn't like moving to different conference rooms to doing this, but it wasn't that. But our next meeting is on the 10th of June, and the venue is to be decided. Thank you very much indeed. It's 12:20.